What's your creepiest real life story? I was in Minot, ND with my old band. Our tour van blew a head gasket and we were stuck there for a few days. Everyone was tired on day 2, but I was wide awake. I walk for a bit and make it to some scummy bar. I'm obviously not from around there, and nobody is saying a word to me. After 2 beers, I start to get a tad nauseous and dizzy. I put my head in my hand and try to let it pass, but it keeps getting worse. Suddenly, a voice says, "You'll feel pain tonight." I jump and look up and a tall, roughly 40-year-old man is walking to the bathroom. Turns back and glances at me. I called my friends and got the fuck out of there. I slept for 12-13 hours and felt awful loopy the next day. I was roofied. Probably the creepiest thing to happen to me was when I stayed the night at a friend's place. We slept together in her twin-size bed since I don't like sleeping outside of a bedroom and her house is known to have supernatural occurrences. Well, we had been asleep for a while, and I woke up at around 6 in the morning and had to answer the call of nature. While I was in the bathroom, I looked down at my thigh and I noticed something rather odd. There was a red handprint on my thigh. It was also facing as if someone were behind me and had their hand on my thigh, so fingers pointed to the feet. I pressed my hand to it to see if maybe I fell asleep on my hand and it left a mark. But my hand was way smaller than the mark. And my friend has smaller hands than I, so it couldn't have been her. I'm a light sleeper, so no one could have come into the bedroom without me knowing. And especially no one could have touched me. She took a picture and we didn't go back to sleep. Still have no idea what caused it. When I was little, around 8, I hated going to the dentist. He always made me uncomfortable for some reason. I remember thinking his smile stretched too far and seemed forced, like clowns. Anyway, my mom always came with me, and went back so I wouldn't be scared. One day, my dad had me, divorced parents, and had to take me to the dentist, but tried to make me go back alone so he could sit out in the lobby doing whatever. The assistants had to literally drag me back to the room and you could hear me screaming and crying down the hall, refusing to sit in the chair. Finally, my dad came back to get me. Irritated I'd made a scene, he rescheduled my appointment to when my mom would have me, and we just left. He made a big deal about how bad I was acting and told my mom she was spoiling me and all sorts of shit. 2 weeks later, it's on the news that my dentist was charged with child pornography after molesting children under anesthesia and photographing it. Coming home late from a friend's house in a real bad area of Los Angeles. I mean, these streets were gang infested, so I used to walk around with a hammer in my waist because I couldn't get a gun. An old station wagon with all the windows blocked out by aluminum foil pulls up and an old man looks at me and uses his hand to beckon me to come in. I showed him the hammer. He just keeps beckoning. I got the creeps and started running and cut through a park. He was already waiting for me. I had to jump a couple of fences to lose him. He looked like a fucking widow. I was born and raised in North Dakota. Back when I was in high school, a group of us would research murders that occurred out in the county. We would then go out to find the scenes and film the exploration at night. This was about 2 years before Blair Witch. It was something to do while we got wasted on shitty beer and teenage bullshit. Eventually we ran out of places to go. ND equals few people, few murders, and got really good at finding abandoned rural farmsteads by driving dirt roads and looking for the signs. Rut roads, deliberate tree grows, and old mailbox posts were common markers. We were out looking when we spotted a tree grove that was out of place. Sure sign, and drove through the field and discovered an old, but not too old, house. It had padlocks on the outside doors that were knocked off pretty easily. We dispatched of them and entered the kitchen. There were 6 of us, all with flashlights, and we lit up the kitchen dining area fairly easily. The table was the initial thing you noticed, and it was strange because of how normal it looked. It was set for a meal and not a bowl was out of place. Only thing was, we'd been in dozens of these houses and place settings were a first, especially unbroken ones. As we investigated the area, we found the fridge had the disgusting remnants of a full stock, and the cupboards were full of canned and dry foods. This was also a first. One guy found mail on the counter from early June 1978 and another found a creepy-ass TV guide in the living room with UFOs on the cover. All the family photos were hanging up. Mom, dad, bro and sis in their 1970s glory. Furniture was dusty, but in good condition. Closets were full. Everything was totally normal, which was super abnormal. As we dug around the house, we all started to realize that this house had not been moved out of. It had been straight up abandoned. Imagine locking the door to your house and never coming back. That's the state this house was in. Complete unplanned departure. We went upstairs and split into 3 pairs to check out the 3 rooms. Ours was the closest and obviously it was the younger boy's room. I can't describe what it looked like too well because almost right away from the hall, we heard the most fucking terrifying scream I've ever had the misfortune of hearing. We went running into the hallway and were all yelling questions at each other at the same time. After a few really long seconds, the 2 screamers caught their breath and said, "You have to go in and see." Walking down the hall and through the doorway, I prayed I wouldn't act like a pussy in front of my friends. I shouldn't have been concerned because the others were as scared as I was. The room itself opened up to the left of the doorframe and centered on the right side of the room was a queenish-sized bed, propped up on pillows, with the blanket drawn to the waist, arms on top of the blanket. And worst of all, head turned slightly so it was looking you straight in the eyes when you entered the room was a life-sized porcelain doll. Snow white skin, jet black hair, cold dead eyes. The dead eyes lit up with our flashlights, like she was waiting for us. If the head hadn't been turned I could excuse it, but it was turned, ready for when we walked in, ready for 20 years. Hasty effing exits were made down the stairs and into the car. It was during the ride we started to get even more creeped out when we realized that even though the house had been abandoned, someone had taken the time to set up that goddamn doll. Not packing food, clothes, or family photos. Setting up the doll was one of the last things done in this house. We researched their names, but got nothing. No tragic car accident, no grisly massacre, no extended family. Just a tacky time capsule in the middle of nowhere. We found out that the county had taken possession of the land for non-payment of taxes, explaining the locks, but never tracked down any more information on what happened to them, or why they left that doll. When I was little my mom would take me to Kmart and let me wander around the toy section while she shopped. Normal in the 70s. One day, as I was playing Simon Says, an old man walked up to me and was making small talk while I played. He eventually told me to come with him and took me by the hand. We walked right down the main center aisle of the store right towards the exit sign in the back. As we crossed the last row, I looked to the right and saw my mom at the end of the row. I told him I saw my mom and had to go. I pulled away my hand and ran down to her. I didn't tell her what happened because I didn't want to get in trouble for going with a stranger. It was several years later that I realized that I had probably narrowly avoided being molested, kidnapped, or worse. In a cold winter night in a remote village from Quebec, Canada, in 1990, me and my 2 brothers were asleep. We were 1, 3, and 6 years old. In the middle of the night, someone entered our house without knocking, walked around and was talking to himself. Our house is 2 miles from the village, in a rural area. My father woke up, went to the living room where the guy was. He had a car accident 1 mile from our house with his buddy who died instantly, and his scalp fell in front of his face. So the first time my father saw him, he saw a man with no face. He was drunk and his body was frozen. He was speaking to himself, "Je vais mourir," which means, "I'm gonna die." The fact that his face was partially frozen might have saved his life, preventing him to lose too much blood. My father took him to the hospital at 25 kilometers from our house by car. He did survive. To this day, my father is still blessing the fact that we never woke up during the night with all the noise. When I was in middle school my friends and I were hanging out on a trampoline in the backyard late at night, maybe like 11 p.m. or so. The backyards are all connecting, meaning there is trees and small fences separating them but you can walk through them. Some guy comes through and asks if we have seen a little orange tabby cat and we told him no. He said he lives around the corner, if we see it he will give us a reward. Okay, cool. We think nothing of it and go back to talking about Pokemon cards and why Charizard is a god on paper. No joke. 2 minutes after this guy leaves, this little cat wanders through and we think is that the cat he was talking about. My friend grabs it and we all proudly march to the guy's house to collect our reward. The guy is sitting on his front porch and we bring the cat to him. He's so excited and says, "Oh, I have the reward inside, just come in and I'll give it to you." We were kinda sketched out but we decided to go in and to stay. He says, "Oh, if you don't come in I can only give the reward to the ones that come in." He was gonna give $100 a person to go in. Still, we had 2 guys go in and take what felt like forever, but they came out and had $200 with them. They said there was plastic on everything in there and something felt wrong. I feel as though if we all went we would have been killed. But keeping 2 outside that knew where their friends were I guess was enough to deter him. Still was a weird occurrence. I was walking with my older brother one night. We were returning from a game he had. It was probably 9-10 at the time. I was maybe 10. For some perspective, I'm now 18 going on 19 in a month. We were approaching the apartment building I live at, and we saw a figure. He was probably the size of an average man. Not surprisingly, the darkness conceals his upper body, including his face. We stopped dead in our tracks. Usually security guards patrol the grounds at this time, but their rounds start at 11. This really shouldn't have scared us. But he started to run toward us. I mean sprint. He was running really fast at us. My older brother screamed at me to run. He chased us for an entire length of a street, until my older brother told me to go under a fence that is arching above the ground. Perfect for our sizes. We were scared shitless as we saw him try to climb over the fence. But luckily we were very close to home. A week later, we found out that a child went missing the night after we escaped. To this day, the child was never found. I lived in a small college town and my apartment complex was walking distance from the bar downtown area. One weekday night, I stepped out on our front porch to smoke a cigarette or two. I was up late studying. I brought my textbook with me and sat down on the stairs while I smoked. A girl, who I had never met but who lived one apartment over but down on the ground floor, came home from downtown. She was by herself and you could tell from her walk she had been drinking. She got in her apartment and barely got the door closed before some guy, who came out of nowhere, knocked on her door. She opened and I noticed he introduced himself, which was weird because it was after 2:30 a.m. Who comes to a strange girl's apartment at that time? So I decide to stay outside and pay attention. They ended up talking for over 10 minutes. She later acknowledged how weird the situation was but did not know how to end the conversation. He would do the creepiest things, like he reached up and strokes her hair at least 3 times, and would try and slowly inch his way closer to her and the door. I made a point of being loud with my textbook so he would know I was there and he disappeared as eerily as he had come. We called the cops, and days later they had the girl and me sit with a sketch artist. As soon as the sketch was made public, floods of calls came in. Guy turned out to be a serial rapist who followed lone girls home from bars and pretended to be a cab offering them a ride. This girl just got lucky because she lived so close to the bars. He didn't get a chance to pull the cab routine. Went camping with some friends on hill a few kilometers out in the woods from one of the guy's house. There's a few hiking 4-wheeling trails in the area that led up to the hill so it's known by the locals. It was about midnight. We had a fire going and were just sitting around having a good time. Then the guy, there was 4 of us, sitting opposite of me, yells, "Who are you?" I turn around and there's this man, about 6 feet tall, staring at us from the edge of the woods with a big rock in his hand. One guy knocked an arrow in the compound bow we had. The guy across from me grabbed the hatchet and I pulled the knife off my belt. We had no clue what we were doing but the guy wouldn't say anything to us. He eventually just backed into the woods. No sleep was had that night and we kept a very large fire going. Once I was walking my dog in a park in London, Ontario. There are houses that sit on the edge of the park and back onto the Thames River and hiking trails. It was a pretty hot day and my dog was thirsty so I brought him to the river to drink. We got down to the river and were behind a house with a large privacy fence that sat on the edge of the park. While my dog was drinking I heard loud banging noises coming from the backyard, like a hammer. I thought somebody was building a shed or something. All of a sudden the hammer stops and a man says, "Shut up. Nobody knows you're here," and the banging began again. I froze in fear and then ran up the bank back into the park. I was now directly beside said creepy house. A man came out of the backyard gate in fatigues with a rusty old wheelbarrow, heading towards 2 quintessential kidnapping vans parked in front of his house. He noticed me looking at him as I was walking past, set down the wheelbarrow and just stared at me until I was out of the park. I called the police when I got home, and I still have no idea what happened. Working as a paramedic, I was dispatched to what went out as a simple assault call in a bad neighborhood. This was around 10 p.m. We arrived at the address to find a man standing behind a row of parallel parked cars in front of his house, yelling in a strange high-pitched voice. The police were trying to calm him down. Our first assumption walking up to him was that this was the guy who was injured, but once we got the gurney around the parked cars we saw what was really going on. A dead man was leaned up against a Mini Cooper, slouched in the gutter. I'll never forget coming around the car to find him. There was this really unsettling moment that lasted about 2 seconds where I thought he was alive and staring at me, then realizing he was looking through me, then realizing he was dead. He was shirtless and had been stabbed multiple times, and these were brutal wounds. Most stabbings I'd seen up till that point seemed to be simple penetrations, but this guy's chest and abdomen had been torn to shreds. It was nasty. The guy standing on the curb was yelling in that weird warbly voice, crying, asking if his roommate would be okay. We started CPR and scooped him up and took him to the hospital, knowing that there really was no chance for this guy. After the doctor pronounced him, a couple of cops came over from the scene to square away business involving the victim. One of them really dropped a bomb on us. The story they had heard before our arrival was that the victim had left the house to have a smoke, and when his roommate came out to check on him, he found him stabbed to death outside. But after we left for the hospital, someone noticed a trail of blood leading from the house to the curb, implying that he had been stabbed inside. When the police confronted the roommate about this, he managed to run inside and barricade himself in the house. There was actually a SWAT team over there dealing with the situation as we spoke. So anyway, the person who had most likely brutally murdered our patient that night had been standing there right behind me for most of the call. Pretty creepy. A few years back I rented an apartment from a friend of mine. He had recently bought it and had it completely renovated. He put it up for sale but couldn't find a buyer, so I offered to rent it in the meantime. After moving in, I realized there was something wrong with the lady next door. She was about 45 but looked much older. She would sit up all night listening to Christian radio shows and talking loudly to someone. It got to the point where I couldn't sleep, so I went over to her place and asked her to keep it down. She opened her door and I got a quick peek. Her walls all had crosses painted on them in different colors, and words like Jesus and angels scribbled everywhere. The windows were painted black, letting no light in at all. It was damp. Yellow-stained 50-year-old carpets. Dog crap and cockroaches everywhere. No dog though. I asked her to please keep it down. She just looked at me and shut the door. Then she turned up the radio even louder. The next night I had my girlfriend staying over. I wake up in the middle of the night and see a shadow of a person next to the bed looking at us sleeping. I think I'm hallucinating, as I usually do in the dark when I'm sleepy. But then the shadow starts talking. It's my neighbor and she's holding something in her hand. She broke in during the night and who knows how long she stood there. You should lock your door at night, she says, and walks out. The next morning I hear someone making strange noises below my bedroom window. It's my neighbor talking to herself in tongue. She has a plastic bag in her hand with her rotting dead dog inside. It's hot as hell outside and I can smell death from the bag. At this point I'm scared shitless. She's obviously very insane. I go upstairs and knock on another person's door and ask what the hell is going on. The guy is as scared as me. Apparently she broke into his apartment one evening as well while he was watching TV with his kids. He got up from the couch to get a snack only to find her behind the couch staring at him holding a power drill. Now I know what was in her hand. At this stage I'm basically pooping myself. I call the cops and they know all about her. Apparently she is a violent schizo and she hasn't taken her meds. But they can't force her or enter her apartment without her permission because she owns it. The only thing they can do is get her when she goes outside. I sit up for the next 2 days waiting for her to run out of cigarettes. When I hear her leave at 2 AM to go across the road to the 7-Eleven, I call the cops. They have 3 cars and a special van over in less than 2 minutes. They restrain her and throw her in the van and drive off to some institution, and in less than a minute it's like she was never there. I never see her again. Still have nightmares about her looking at me in my sleep. When I was about 6, a car drove by my house while I was outside on a slip and slide with my next door neighbor. The car slowed down when he got close to me, rolled down his window and started talking to me, but he was talking kind of quiet to where I couldn't make out what he was saying. So I walked closer and he asks, "Don't you go to the school down the street?" I said, "Oh yeah." "Why?" "Because my son said he recognized you." I heard the car door unlock and there was a man in his mid-30s sitting in the back seat. Right as the door started to open, I feel someone grab me by the collar of shirt and yank me into their arms. It was my neighbor's mom. She dragged me all the way back to her house, and as soon as the driver saw her, he peeled off. When we got back to the house, she called the cops immediately. I didn't even realize how close I was to getting kidnapped until I saw my mom crying when she heard about what happened. So me and my friend decide to go explore this old group of houses. Probably from 1930s. Anyway, the main house has 3 stories and is so overgrown a fully grown tree is blocking the door. Naturally, the only other way to get in is through the cellar doors. So we go down using nothing but our phone lights, and it wasn't really creepy at all, although the ceiling was low, about 5 feet high. So we go to the 2nd floor and once again there is nothing. No furniture or trash. Just nothing, so we go upstairs and it's the same story. However, at this point the 2 of us realize the place is spotless and has none of the normal dust and dirt. No. It was immaculate, which is creepy in itself. So we go upstairs and nothing once again. We do however notice a piece of plywood has been screwed into the wall, and so obviously we rip it off to see what lies behind. What we found was the stairs to the attic. When we went to the attic there was a single chair sitting facing out of the only window in the attic. So I'm superstitious and am scared shitless, but my friend sits down in the fair and realizes that it's placed facing the roller rink across the highway. Pretty creepy. Hope this doesn't get buried. First and probably last time I post this was driving from Atlanta GA to Lexington SC with my GF to visit my parents. I like to drive at night since there are less people on the road and I can take my time. At around 3 AM or so we are making good time. I had stopped at a gas station and picked up some coffee for us and we were due in about an hour. GF was sleeping soundly and I'm listening to a quiet radio humming away. I start getting a little drowsy and take a sip. Road was just as my coffee. No cars in sight except for a spotted few on the side of the road here and there. In the distance I can make out what looks like a hitchhiker, or what I think is one, but can't really tell due to such low light. As I get closer I start to notice other things, like how the person is kinda thin and tall and completely, for the most part, apparently brown. I'm right up on this thing now, and at about 20 feet it turns around and locks eyes with me as I pass by. This was no person, and it is the most terrifying thing I have ever seen in my life. It was a deer, or I tell myself it was. I have seen deer stand on their hind legs to fight, but they still have deer posture when they do. Not only that, but I was watching this thing walk for about 30 seconds from first seeing it in the distance to passing it. The posture it had was human. Standard biped stance. Arms back, chin down. But the worst part was the eyes, or lack thereof. In their place were 2 large black pits, almost black polish. I'll never forget the stare down it gave me. The instant I passed it I had the only panic attack I've ever had in my life. I had to wake up my GF to keep calm enough to get to an exit with a large gas station a few miles away. Like hell I was going off a ramp close to that thing. After we pulled into the station I had a complete meltdown. I started crying harder than I ever thought I could. I couldn't talk, breath, or do anything but want to curl into a ball and cry. After around 30 minutes or so, she finally gets me to calm down enough to tell her what happened. While I don't think she believed what I think I saw, she knew that I was convinced and legitimately scared to death. Every once in a blue moon I will dream about it and wake up crying or in a cold sweat. And she will tease me about it or roll over and ignore me instead of comforting me about the one thing that I've ever been terrified of. But I know what I saw, and I know it will haunt me for the rest of my life.